Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. And today we're chatting with Walt, who wrote the book At First Light. But before we talk about your book, Walt, tell us who you are and how you started writing and everything, because I know looking in your bio, you've written 41 books, and that's an amazing accomplishment as it is. But before we start talking about writing, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My whole life, I was with my current wife. We met when we were 5 years old, Barb and I, at University Methodist Kindergarten in Baton Rouge. Both of our dads were professors there. And so we went through life together and into college together. Barb majored in education, and I majored in marine biology and zoology and chemistry because I couldn't figure out the path that was set before me, but ended up being called into medicine. And then we left Baton Rouge, went to New Orleans, and Barb worked as a teacher at an all-girls Catholic school and put me through medical school. From there, overseas to a Queen's Fellowship, which was a real honor to be a physician in the Queen's system. And then back to Duke for a residency in family medicine and sports medicine. Then about in your neck of the woods, Melissa, not far from where you live, for residency. And then we moved out to Bryson City, North Carolina, for about 5 years. And that was a time of getting into a rural practice. We had some difficulties there. Our young children were sexually abused by a babysitter, which led to us leaving that small town and regrouping as a family in Florida, down in a little town, then little town called Kissimmee. And I practiced there for about 16 years. Our practice was a teaching practice, meaning we published research, we had med students and residents there, and we did all of the small town stuff that small town doctors do. But that led to writing. There was a journal called the American Family Physician. It was the third most distributed medical journal in the world after the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of American Medical Association. And the editor of that journal had heard about our little small town practice, and his dad had been a small town general practitioner. And so he asked us to begin a column called Diary of a Practice, which we did in 1990. And that diary went on for 10 years. It was the most popular part of that journal. I think, Melissa, it kind of took people back to a time in the past, you know. And anyway, that caught the eyes of a publisher who asked if I would do some books about my practice years in Bryson City. And that sort of started my writing career. I wasn't trained as a writer, but those editors used a lot of red ink to teach me all the mistakes. The last 5 years of practice, I became the medical director at Fox News. They had a studio at that time in Orlando and produced a channel called the Fox Health Network. And so I started doing a television show on that network, and that ran about 5 years. And then that led to us in 2001 leaving practice and moving up to Colorado Springs. And I worked for a media organization for about 5 years doing, health stuff, and then left that media industry and went back into practice. I've been a practicing family physician now, almost 41 years, and then a writer now for about 23 years.
So how do you find time to write when you're also practicing medicine? Because I know medicine, you don't have a lot of downtime with that.
No, you really don't. But what you're called to do, what you have a passion to do, what brings you joy and satisfaction and completeness, no matter how hard it is, you'll find time to do. I sometimes will have people, Barb and I also direct a marriage ministry at our church. And every now and then I'll have someone tell me, well, I don't have time for that, or whatever that is. And if I could just be a little bit crass, I will look at them and I'll say, well, do you have time to pee? Of course, they say, well, well, yeah, but what's that got to do with anything? I said, well, my point is that you always have time to do what's important to do, what's critical
Mm.
to do, what's a priority. So it's not really that you don't have time to do it. It's that you don't want to do it, or you don't have the bandwidth, or it's not a priority. And writing is really hard work, because it's not just writing, but it's rewriting and rewriting and editing and working with editors and publishers and PR and marketing, and it just goes on and on and on. And so if you can't chisel out the time, maybe you're not called for it. Now, initially for me, that meant writing after the kids were down. Barb and I always prioritized our time with our children. We always prioritized meal time. And so after the kids went to bed, and Barb likes to read in the evening, that was initially my writing time. And then over time, as the practice cut back, as I cut back on my practice hours, I was able to increase my writing hours over time.
So you had to be kind of disciplined too, as well, correct? And you kind of had to set aside time, like, okay, this is family time, this is writing time, this is time that I'm focusing on my business. So how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's actually scheduled time. Now I'm usually up, just the way I am. I'm usually up 4:30, 5 in the morning, something like that. And so I have a little quiet time, a little time for tea, just to kind of get centered in the day. I've got a little soft chair where I sit and look out. Our home looks out over the Pikes Peak. We're in the Front Range of Colorado. And so to be able to watch the sun come up on Pikes Peak is for me just a real centering, sort of a prayer time, quiet time. And then after that, I go to work as a writer. I sit down at the blank screen and I start. I do have some procrastination. I'll sharpen a pencil, even though I don't write with a pencil, and I'll shut off all the social stuff, all the social sites and the email. I will check email to see if there's anything critical, but shut all that down, and then it's writing time. And for me, normally the first thing I do in the morning is edit what I wrote the day before, and then once I'm finished with that, then it's time for new, whatever I have for that day. It may be a certain number of pages, or it may be a certain number of words. It may be researching a particular topic, or gathering some more research information. And then once the kids have gone now, but once Barb's up and moving about, we have a commitment to have our meals together. And so when it's time for breakfast, she'll give me a warning, because guys, we kind of get in these little boxes. We have our writing box and our hobby box and our talking box. And so she'll say, hey, Walt, 20 minutes till our time, and 10 minutes. And once we get there, I shut it down, and then it's on into the day.
I love that. The fact that you still have that commitment and knowing that you committed to eat meals together, because nowadays a lot of family, a lot of couples don't have that commitment to have meals together, because, or either that you see with their phones and they're on social media on their phones while they're eating their meals together, and you don't see them having conversations. So I absolutely applaud you for that. Is that one of the reasons why the marriage has lasted that long?
I think that's part of it. Although we really, really work at our marriage. We had an agreement when we began our marriage that we would never use the divorce word. And although we've had some times where it came really close, Barb kind of jokingly says that her favorite Bible verse about marriage is "Thou shalt not murder," and so that's helped to have that commitment. We've always read marriage books together. We've always gone to marriage conferences. We try to do one every 2 or 3 years. We now are involved in a marriage ministry, but before we directed that ministry, in the past, we were always part of a small group. We'd always have a group of people kind of about our same age. So it might be a parenting small group, or it might be a marriage small group where we've gotten together with people once a week to once a month, if you would. But that time together with meals has just been absolutely critical for us. I've written a couple of parenting books. One's called God's Design for the Highly Healthy Teen, and one's God's Design for the Highly Healthy Child. And in both of those books, I talk about the research that shows that the more meals a family has together, the better those kids do, almost by every single measure that you can think of. School performance, psychological satisfaction, reduced depression, reduced anxiety, improved self-image, better grades. They have less drug use, illicit drug use, less smoking, less uh, sex out of relationship, out of marriage, less unwed pregnancy, less criminal activity. By any measure, the more meals a family has together, the better the kids do. And you're right; those meals have to have a couple of rules. The first is that the parents have to be committed to it. The second is that we used to call it our EFZ, our electronic free zone, that everybody's electronics are off. The phones are off. They go to message, and we really commit to each other. And Barb always had a rule that mealtime was not a time for the parent who is the critic or for the parent who criticizes. And mealtime was a time for us really to listen to our kids. How did it go today? What worked? What didn't work? How do you feel? And it just became this super bonding time for us. And it still is. Our kids are adults now. They've moved out. Of course, one of our son has our grandchildren, and they and their families still practice those same disciplines. And I think it says to each other, you matter to me. And of course, to Barb and I, it says to each other, you matter to me.
I love that. I love the fact that you also wrote about that. And you also wrote about a lot of different things happening in your life. And when we come back from the commercial, we're going to talk about one of the books that you wrote about that honestly I identify with as well. So we'll be right back after this brief commercial.
Hi, my name is Joanna, and I would like to share with you a little bit about Shores of Grace, Shores Philly. It's a ministry located in Philadelphia. The portion of Shores that I volunteer for goes into Kensington, an area greatly impacted by homelessness and addiction. And we go and we take love, food, clothing, snacks, conversation. We believe that it is a way that we can meet people right where they are and show them the love of Jesus. We have seen lives changed in big ways and in small ways, and we have built wonderful relationships with the people in the community. We have big plans, more we'd like to do, and we would appreciate any support, either through prayer or through donation. If you would like to donate, you can go to shoresofgrace.com, and in the menu, click on Donate. And we just ask that you put Philly in your donation comments. Thank you.
And we are back talking with Walt. And Walt, you wrote a book called At First Light, which talks about your father's heroics in World War II. And my dad was in Vietnam. And one of the things that I noticed when I was reading over your media kit was that you found a lot of things about your dad after he passed away. And I found a lot of things about my dad's heroics after he passed away. And it's amazing how they didn't share this with us when they were alive. How did that make you feel?
Well, it was wonderful when we finally started talking. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There were 4 of us boys that grew up, and back in those days, that was a long time ago. But back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of World War II movies. There were television shows about World War II. All the boys played World War II soldiers with each other. And where I live, some of the boys would talk about their dad's exploits and their dad's heroics. And I knew my dad had been in the war, and I knew he had lost a leg in the war. But that's all I knew. He would not talk about it. And I hoped he was a hero. I wanted him to be a hero, but I just didn't know. I did know that his little home office, that there was a shadow box hanging on the wall full of medals, and there were pictures on his wall signed by generals, General Eisenhower and General Devers and General Truscott and General Young, General Patton, some of these famous generals of World War II who had signed and autographed the pictures to my dad. Eisenhower had written to a fighting man, and General Young had written to one of the finest young frontline officers in World War II. So I kind of hoped that he had done something that us boys would be proud of, but he just wouldn't talk about it. I would ask Mom, how come he won't tell us? And she said, it's just not ready to talk about it yet. But when he and Mom hit their 45th wedding anniversary, which was 1994, all the families were gathered together to celebrate that. And us boys were with Dad just off to the side talking. And my youngest brother said, "Dad, how'd you really lose your leg?" Because he would kid us. He would say, "Yeah, one time I was out hunting and there was a fly that landed on my knee, and I'm a sharpshooter, so I went to shoot the fly, but I missed." I shot my knee. But Rick said, "Dad, really, how'd you lose your leg? How'd it really happen?" And at night, I guess it was a combination of nostalgia, a combination of being with his family, maybe a beer. I don't know. I've come to learn now that the secret mission he was involved with had a 45-year embargo. And so I now wonder, I don't know, but I now wonder if that was part of it, that he finally felt the freedom to talk about the past. And so he began to open up with us boys. And I want to tell you the truth, Melissa, as he began to tell the stories, we didn't believe him. I mean, they literally were unbelievable. You know, I was part of a secret mission to save the Lipizan stallions from extinction. I was the youngest frontline officer in World War II. I was one of the most decorated frontline officers in World War II. I recovered in a hospital with Audie Murphy, arguably the most decorated soldier in World War II, and we became friends. And I watched Audie Murphy proposed to a nurse in the hospital. And oh, by the way, the day I lost my leg, I had a bunch of men that were trapped. I jumped on the back of a tank. I was manning a 50 caliber machine gun. I saved my men, killed over 100 Germans, and then was shot in the leg by a sniper. And we all kind of sat there and just didn't believe it. But over the next 9 years of his life, he began to share more stories with more people. He was a Boy Scout leader, and so he'd share the stories with the scouts and with the scout leaders and with people. He headed the map making department, the cartography department at LSU. We call it Harvard on the Bayou. And the stories always lined up, and that intrigued me. It made me think it was more likely to be true. Then in 2003, he passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. And 3 years later, my mom passed away, again, unexpectedly. And as my brothers and I were cleaning out their home, I found an Army footlocker up in the attic. And when I opened it up, it contained some of his uniform, some of his equipment. It contained 3 history books, all of which had little tags in it. And all of the tags documented one of the stories he told us. Found 436 letters that he had written home to his mom, to his dad, to his best friend. Many of those letters documented the stories. And what I did, Melissa, I never had written a military book or a history book. But I just wanted to make a family record. So I began typing out those letters just in my free time chronologically to kind of get a sense of his life from elementary school all the way up to when he married Mom. And as I developed that, there'd be holes between the letters. He'd say, "Well, we just landed at Anzio." And then there'd be a 4-week period where there would be nothing recorded till the next letter. And so I began to study history books and look up references and began to fill in those holes. As I found the stories were true, I began to travel overseas to Anzio and Rome and Paris and France. And then about 13 military institutions and archives in this country, unearthing memoirs of people that he fought with, interviews of people that he fought with that led him, additional records that documented his stories. And then that finally, after 16 years of research, came together in the book At First Light.
Wow. How did it feel when you're researching and you went to where he stood? How did it feel to stand where he stood and to look out and see, wow, my dad was here and he fought here? How did that feel for you?
Well, it was stunning. He fought on the Southern Front. Most people who know about World War II in Europe know about the Northern Front, but almost nobody that I've interviewed or talked to knows anything about the Southern Front. So, Melissa, can we do a quick experiment with you?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So when I say D-Day, what do you think of?
You think about Pearl Harbor, you think about all that, but I was looking at your research and I did not know there was 70 days.
Right. Everybody thinks about Normandy, don't they? And the Southern guys had 7. Well, the whole Southern Front had 5 D-Days, but the 3rd Infantry Division that Dad fought in had 7 amphibious D-Days. Nobody knows that. People know that the Northern Front had 1 Battle of the Bulge. The Southern Front had 2 Battle of the Bulges. People know that the Northern Front had the Hurtgen Forest debacle, the terrible forest fighting. The Southern Front had 2 forest battles. People know that the Northern Front liberated Paris, but they don't know that 2 months earlier, the Southern Front liberated Rome, and it was the first European capital liberated. People know about the terrific casualties that occurred on the northern side, but the Southern Front had dramatically more casualties. In fact, the 3rd Infantry Division, the division in which Dad fought, ran between 10 and 12,000 soldiers at any one time, had over 35,000 casualties. And the average life expectancy of a frontline junior officer in Southern Europe was 21 days. Yet Dad fought through 415 days, and the 3rd Infantry Division fought through 913 days. On the Northern Front, they fought for 336 days. Now, this is in no way to demean D-Day. It was the largest amphibious assault in history. We couldn't have won the war without the Northern Front, but nor could we have won the war without the Southern Front. And so to retrace those steps, to see where on Anzio, the men were holed up for 4 months. Literally, Melissa, it was the same as the trench warfare of World War I. If any of our listeners, our viewers, watched the movie that's over this last year, All Quiet on the Western Front, you say, well, that was horrible in World War I. That's exactly what Anzio looked like in World War II, except at Anzio, the men were surrounded by a mountain range. The Germans were dug into the mountain range, and they literally could bomb the Allies 24 hours a day, day and night. So the men were forced to dig in and to dig in deep. And it was frozen and snowy and rainy, and it was a swamp. So there was malaria and there was disease, and it was just miserable. And that's just one battle of many that Dad fought in. So a long answer to a short question, to look out over those tombstones in the American graves, to go to the monuments that memorialize these terribly terrific and difficult battles, any one of which the Americans and the Allies could have lost, to see how those soldiers sacrificed and how they suffered, but also to sense the success that they had and the freedom and liberty that they've given to each one of us. And quite frankly, I think there's some of us that don't appreciate their suffering and sacrifice or the freedom they gave us.
That is so true. And I think it's can be said true to every soldier that nobody appreciates them. Because I think going back to, like I said, my dad fought in Vietnam. When the Vietnam soldiers came back, they were spit on. They weren't appreciated at all. And United States, my dad unfortunately died of exposure to Agent Orange years later. I mean, he died in 2014 from the exposure of Agent Orange. So I have so much appreciation for the soldiers, even those that have, even now, because there's still the repercussions of when they fought in wars. So what made you decide? You said that you were starting and you wrote this book more. You wrote this more as a chronological to try for your family history. But what made you decide to say, I need to publish this?
Well, as I would utilize a whole bunch of technical advisors. So military physicians, I wanted to be sure that I understood the wounds and the care that they got. Military nurses to understand nursing care in those days. Weapons experts, because I didn't know anything about the weapons or the artillery or the armor. I wanted to have that right. Also, military history experts who could help me with the chronology of some of the events and help me find additional material. But as I developed these stories, the feedback, I mean, it's nice when one or two people say, hey, this should be a book. People would really like this. This should be a movie. This should be a miniseries. Okay, fine. But after a while, after you have more and more and more people telling you that, you go, well, maybe there is something here worth sharing to others. the fact that people didn't really know about the Southern Front, of the suffering and sacrifice and success that led to the victory in Europe, and the fact that this almost Forrest Gump-like character had so many amazing stories that ended up being true. And he had interactions with Winston Churchill. He had interactions with General Eisenhower. He had interactions with Harry Truman, President Truman. All of that played into the story. As an amputee in World War II times, Melissa, if you were an enlisted soldier and you lost a limb, you could keep in the military as long as there was a job for you. But if you were an officer, you were no longer considered an officer and a gentleman. You were not, by some, you weren't even considered fully human, but you certainly weren't considered officer material. And he decided to fight that battle, to fight the Department of Defense policy. And he enlisted senators, representatives, military generals, President Truman himself, all to aid in that final battle of his, to be able to honor men and women who were amputees so that they could stay in the military as officers. And of course, for the men as officers and gentlemen. And I still remember the day that I was in the National Archives up in Washington, D.C., actually in College Park, Maryland. I spent a little over a week there. And the archivists were just magnificent of finding every recorded record they had for his company and his battalion and his regiment and his division. Over 175 boxes of materials that I went through page by page by page by page. But one day I was sorting through those materials and I came across a thick pack of paper, maybe about a quarter of an inch thick. And Melissa, it was the transcript of the final hearing, the final trial that was designed to throw him out of the Army, his final battle. And it was, for any of our listeners that watched the movie A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, where Tom Cruise was the interrogator, the JAG officer, and of course Jack Nicholson was the Marine general. But this intense courtroom scene, my dad played that out with his own courtroom. And so to be able to find that type of material, and finally, I was going to make it a novel because the stories really were unbelievable. Saving the Lipizzanes, unbelievable story. And so, but I was thinking of doing a novel. And so I have a good friend who's written 170 novels. We're in a writer's group together. His name is Jerry Jenkins. And we were talking about it. And so he looked at a few chapters. And then he told me this. He said, you can't do it as a novel. And I said, well, why not? He said, because novels have to be believable. And these days, nonfiction has to be unbelievable. And these stories are unbelievable. So you need to do it as a nonfiction book. And so I transitioned it to a nonfiction book. And then when it finally was in a finished form, my agent took it out to the market. And within 3 days, we had some wonderful offers for the book that led to its publication.
Wow. You have your book with you, and I know you picked out a section. Do you want to read us a section from the book?
Well, I can. A little background on this section. Dad, before he fought his final battle to stay in the Army, when he came back from Europe, he lost his leg 30 days before the end of the war. So it was just right. It was April 8th, 1945, and the war ended in Europe on May 8th, 1945. So he was evacuated to a field hospital where he had initial surgery, and then back a little bit further where they had to do an amputation below the knee. And then he was sent to Reims, France, and that's where he was evacuated from. And that's where General Eisenhower came to see him off. He was sent back to the United States, to Atlanta. The U.S. had, if I remember right, it was 7 hospitals for amputees, and one was Lawson General Hospital in Atlanta. And so he went back to begin his 1 year of rehabilitation, of getting additional surgery, of finally getting into artificial leg to prosthetics and learning how to use those prosthetics. And one thing he noticed, now your daddy, Melissa, and all of the heroes that came back from Southeast Asia were not welcomed in general. As you said, they were spit upon and they were looked down upon. It was different for our World War II soldiers. When they came back, if they had a uniform and they had medals as men, they had women draped all over them. That was just, and I think Dad kind of had that expectation as a single man. But what he learned was that women weren't really interested in amputees. And the difficulties of additional surgery, the difficulties of not being considered a whole man, if you would, led to depression and even thoughts of suicide. And so he decided, rather than to go down that route, to visit with a chaplain at the Army hospital there. And after talking to the chaplain about his feelings, he later wrote down what that chaplain told him, and this is in the book. So this is what how the chaplain counseled him. You can kind of imagine, if you would, a military chaplain, sort of rough, sort of gruff, saying this to my dad. He said, "Son, listen, your wound will either make you a bitter person or a better person. It will either harden your heart or soften it. You'll either be a person changed for the worse or one who chooses to make the world better. But in my opinion, son," he said, "the worst disability in life isn't being disabled. It's being disabled with a bad attitude. Yeah, the Germans smashed your leg, but don't let them shatter your heart. Don't let them ruin your talents, your gifts, your will, or your faith in God and his plan for you. But the choice is really up to you." And so I began to talk to my dad about his personal faith. He hadn't talked about the war very much, and he hadn't talked about his personal faith very much. And I asked him one night, I sort of challenged him, do you have a personal faith? I knew that he and mom and dad went to church, but is this relationship you have with God just kind of a formal thing or kind of an informal thing? And I remember he kind of looked irritated. I remember this part of the book, Melissa, where he just sort of pulled out a piece of paper and he said, "I carried this with me throughout the war, and I'd like you to read it." And I unfolded it, and this is what I read: "No shell or bomb can on me burst, except my God permit it first. Then let my heart be kept in peace. His watchful care will never cease. No bomb above nor mine below need cause my heart one pang of woe. The Lord of hosts encircles me. He is the Lord of earth and sea." As he folded it up, he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Son, I couldn't have survived 15 months, 415 days of living hell, a bloody trail of 3,200 miles in 7 countries involving 10 campaigns. I couldn't have done it without my God walking with me every step. I walked with him and I talked with him, and so did my men, every single one of them." Then he added this wonderful encouragement to me. "Walt," he said, "true faith isn't just words, but it's a heart that overflows with love, gratitude, loyalty, and service." He then quoted a Bible verse, James 2:17, which says, "So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it's dead and useless." It was one of the most powerful lessons that he taught me. And he did it not by a sermon, but by his life, and then attaching to it these words. I just think it's one of the highlights of a book, and encouraging to all of us who have wrestled with various trials and troubles and temptations and difficulties, and certainly in a country that's so politically divided now, to be able to, if you would, see the good in life and to be able to see the good in each other. Perhaps the healing that he experienced is healing that each of us could have.
That is so true. And wow, what a powerful message that you're sharing in the book that your dad shared with you and you're able to share with others. I mean, that is just I've got chills right now just
Oh,
listening to his words and knowing that he carried that scrap of paper throughout the war with him. I mean, that tells you something. Now, how do you think your dad would have felt about his story being told, about you writing his story?
I think in a way, I think he would be proud, not that his story was told, but that his men's story was told. And in fact, the first drafts of the book really were much more about the forgotten men of the Southern Front. In fact, the book initially was entitled "Forgotten," or it was going to be "Unforgotten," because I wanted to tell the story of the men on the Southern Front. And when I completed that book, and then my agent shopped it out to various publishers, there wasn't much interest in it. I'm not a historian, so it wasn't a history book.
Mhm.
They loved the horse stories. Dad was, as you know, Melissa, a world-class equestrian, and so the book is literally chock full of horse stories throughout the war, including the true story of him saving the Lipizans. Um, but it was more about the Southern Front. So no one wanted it. So my agent one day called me and said, "Hey, Walt, do you know the name Mike Yorkie?" And I said, "I do. Mike and I worked together on a book. I mentioned earlier the book Guides Designed for the Highly Healthy Teen for parents of teenagers. Um, how do you have children that are healthy physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually?" And I loved working with Mike. So I told Greg, I said, I love Mike. I love working with him. We did a book 15 or 20 years ago. And he said, "Well, Walt, he's doing military books now. He's done 6 books. 2 of them are with authors, with other authors, and 2 of them have become bestsellers. Would you be interested in working with him?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think so." So we had a conference call with Mike, and he's done over 200 books. And at that time had books scheduled for the next year and a half. So really no time on his schedule. But he said, "Why don't you do this, Walt? Why don't you send the manuscript to me? I'll read it over the next few months. And
Mhm.
once I've read it, I'll let you know, A, do I think I can help you out? And B, do I even want to help you out? Because I've got a lot of projects and I'm not going to make a commitment till I see what you've done." So anyway, sent him the manuscript and did not expect to hear from him for a while. But Melissa, it was 3, 4, 5 days later, he called and he said, "I finished it." He said, "It's a fabulous book. It needs to be told." And he said, "You have done an amazing job of hiding your father's story. It's completely hidden. I understand why, because in the military world, there's a thing called legacy books. And what that means is someone writes a story about their father or their uncle or their brother who was in a war or in the military, but it's just about them, and maybe it's not very interesting. It's great for the family, but it's not of general interest. And he said, "You've hidden his story, and I see that." But he said, "Would you be open to me just redoing about 5 chapters? I want us to tell his story because it is an unbelievable story." And I said, "Well, yeah, absolutely. Let's do it." And he said, "Now I'm in these other books. So it'll probably be 2, 3 months before I get back to you. Is that okay?" I said, "Yeah." I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
the book's not going anywhere in the meantime. And so, and Melissa, it was 3 or 4 or 5 days later. I mean, within a week, here comes in the email, those 5 chapters have been edited and rewritten by Mike. So I printed them off, and after 16 years, and all the publishers, over 50 publishers, had said no to the book, I just didn't want to be disappointed again. So I printed it off, and I took it into that other room. Barb was sitting there, and I said, "Hey, hon, would you mind taking a look at what Mike has done?" She said, "Sure, yeah, I'd like to." She and Mike really hit it off. They're both World War II aficionados and had read
Uh-huh.
the same World War II books and loved the same books and the same style. Anyway, after a few minutes, after, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, I heard a sound. It was kind of a funny sound. So I got up from my desk here and walked in, and Barb was crying. And I thought, "Oh gosh, I guess it's that bad." you know, you know. And so I sat down and I didn't say anything for a second. I just looked at her and she looked up at me and she wiped her eyes and she said, "Honey, it's beautiful. It's just beautiful." And so called Mike back and said, "Would love to work with you on this book." And he said, "That's fine. I probably can do it the end of next year, about 15 months from now. It's probably take a couple months for me to work on this with you." I said, "That's fine." And then within a week, we get this phone call. It just happened so fast. And Mike called up and he said, "Walt, I was doing a book with Steve Arterburn and Philip Yancey, and I had 3 months scheduled for that book, and it's just been canceled. It's going to be put off for a year. I'm open. I can go to work on this
Wow.
tomorrow." And so we wrote the book and finished it. Greg Johnson, the agent, once we finished it, sent it out, and in 3 days we had 3 offers from 3 major publishers, and then it was published. I'm just so grateful to Mike Yorkie for unearthing that story. Also, Melissa, there's a newer genre in the nonfiction world. Well, I mean, it's been around since perhaps the 30s, but it's become more popular, and it's called creative nonfiction, and it's taking history and writing it as if it was a novel. You have to invent some dialogue to do that. It's got to be very true dialogue to the characters and to the time. But this is creative nonfiction, and as such, because it's a war book, it does have some salty language in it.
Yeah.
And so I warned my readers at the beginning, because I've never had a book before with salty language, but it does have salty language, not gratuitous. It's kind of what you would expect in a war. And I do warn readers of that. But it's such a sweet, redemptive story throughout of a teenager. He was the youngest commissioned officer in World War II, finished youngest graduate of officer candidate school, graduated at 17.
Wow.
You can't even get in until you're usually a college graduate. Was commissioned on his 18th birthday, received his Eagle Scout Award 2 weeks later.
Wow.
There he was on the front. Was with Audie Murphy. He and Audie Murphy became friends, recovered in a hospital together, and did, in fact, watch Audie Murphy propose to Pricey, their nurse. As I mentioned, did have interactions with General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower brought him after his rehabilitation to Washington, D.C. to fight his battle, to stay in the Army. He and his best friend played bridge together. They were professional bridge sharks. General Eisenhower loved to play bridge, and so Dad played bridge with General Eisenhower as he was fighting his discharge. Just before he lost his leg, he was sent on a secret mission about 200 miles behind enemy lines from Germany to Czechoslovakia. The rumors were that Hitler, who had wanted to make the perfect race, the Aryan race, also wanted to develop the perfect horse. And so starting in the late 1930s, he had sequestered all of the royal breeds of horses in horse farms in Czechoslovakia. So the Andalusians and the Berbers and the Frisians and quarter horses and champion thoroughbreds and Lipizans. So basically the entire breeding stock of those breeds in horse farms in Czechoslovakia. And towards the end of the war, because of the Yalta Agreement, the Russians had been given the assignment to liberate Czechoslovakia. But because there was so much starvation in Russia, because the troops were so poorly supplied, literally every farm they came across, they killed and cooked everything that was edible. And so there was a group of Lipizan horses. The records aren't clear. It was either 20 or 22 horses that were being evacuated from a Lipizan, a horse farm in eastern Czechoslovakia, and they were being evacuated to a safer area in western Czechoslovakia. And the Russians came across them, killed all but one of the Lipizans, skinned them, butchered them, cooked them, and ate them. And now the Nazi vets, who were much more vets than they were Nazis, were truly alarmed that the world's breeding population of some of these royal breeds was going to be lost. Dad was an equestrian. And so he was asked to volunteer on a mission to fly 200 miles in a little tiny Piper Cub. He'd have a pilot. He couldn't know the pilot's name. The pilot couldn't know his name. They could not have identification on them. If they were caught or killed, they would be disavowed as being AWOL. If they were killed, they would have no life insurance, no benefits for their family. But Dad took that mission and landed in a forest in Czechoslovakia, and the Czechoslovakia resistance met him, and so he was able to identify the liposons, and then 3 days later, he got back to safety. But that's when he lost his leg, and just these wonderful, amazing stories that not just guys like. In fact, Melissa, there's over 400 reviews on book review sites like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Goodreads. Over 95% are 5-star, and I'm so grateful for that. But the majority of the reviewers are women. The story is not just a war story; it's these stories of romance, of failed romance and final romance, and being turned down and turned away. So there's a romance element for people that like horses, who like Seabiscuit or Warhorse. This book has been compared to those books, and I'm so grateful for that. And yet those who like Laura Hillebrand's Unbroken or Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, this book has been compared to those. I'm not sure it's in that same league, but I'm so grateful to those comparisons. And I hope people will enjoy those. The stories are short. They're written to read quickly, even though it's a long book. It tells a long story. But I'm grateful to have told it for each of us, so that we can remember the shoulders upon which we sit, the footsteps in which we walk, and maybe more deeply and sweetly enjoy the freedom that those men and women entrusted to us.
That is so true. Now, you keep mentioning like the Band of Brothers, which I think HBO came out and did a mini series on it. Do you ever see this book becoming either a movie or a mini series?
Oh, you never know as an author. Right now, it's in the hands of 3 different producers whose people are looking at it. One's a movie house, one's a producer of a miniseries, and another is involved with a streaming service. I don't know if it will or not, because war movies are extremely expensive. I had one producer tell me that a movie of a book like this would cost somewhere between $150 and $200 million. It'd be really expensive just because of the equipment and all of the locations, because it starts in Tennessee when Dad's a little juvenile delinquent. He's raised by parents that both work. He's a latchkey child. He gets in trouble, swims the Mississippi River at flood stage, almost drowns. I mean, just a bad boy. Gets shipped off to military school. And that's where he finds his passion, down in Gulfport, Mississippi, Gulf Coast Military Academy. And then the war hits. And next thing you know, he's in officer candidate school as a teenager, as a 17-year-old, and then going through the war. And then after the war, fighting the battle about the amputations. It's just, it's a fun, meaningful read, and I'm glad to tell it. But I do hope it sees its way onto the big screen or the little screen, only because that's how so many people consume media these days. And so to be able to get a story like this, of that, Tom Brokaw wrote the book, The Greatest Generation. And I'll tell you the truth, Melissa, I thought, well, that's hyperbole, great way to sell a book, but there's been a lot of great generations. Your dad and the heroes of Vietnam, that was a great generation. But as I look back on what those men in particular went through, the sacrifices that they as young teenage boys made, and not just them, but the country. The country accepted rationing, victory gardens, cutting back on everything that they cherished, sweets and sugar and desserts and supplies and petrol and for women in those days, nylons. There was no nylon available for nylons. And Melissa, I'm just not sure our country would make that sacrifice today. And so to look back on a generation, I think probably the greatest generation, that did that unflinchingly and literally stopped in its tracks, the most despicable evil together, people of every religious imagination, people of every color, people of every background, from the wealthiest to the poorest, banded together, not just a band of brothers, but a band of brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and daughters and sons to fight and defeat evil. I'm proud that we carry that heritage, and I hope more of us can look back on it with appropriate pride and gratitude.
That is so true. Now, I'm going to follow up the question about the miniseries or the movie. Do you have a dream person that you would like to play your dad?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Do you have a dream actor that you would like to play your dad?
One of my kids said Tom Hanks. I said, he's too old. But and I'm not gonna remember his name, but the hero of the recent movie Devotion, young kid, just the way he looked, the way he talked. Devotion was about the white pilot and the black pilot in Korea. Both heroes. The black pilot was a Medal of Honor winner who gave his life for his men. But anyway, that officer that co-starred with him, I was really touched by his performance. I would hope it would be somebody that could be a little bit irascible because he was a juvenile delinquent, but also a person who's devoted and loyal and loving, and a person who develops a faith as he walks through some very, very difficult times. So that crossed my mind, but who knows if it'll ever happen.
Now, you mentioned your sons. What did your sons think about when they were holding the book in their hands and they read the book for the first time about their grandpa?
Now, actually, Scott, our youngest, and our son, is a book listener. And so he actually listened to the audio version of the book. He's got the book itself, but he listened to the audio version. And I was so pleased that the man who was the narrator for the book is perhaps the most cherished book narrator in the business. He does Stephen King's books. He does Vince Flynn's books. He's done 2 versions of the Bible. He's done all of the classics, Homer and the Iliad, over 2,000 books. And he actually bid for this book. Wow. And his reading of it is just superb because he not only does the narration well, but he can do the accents of the various, because you've got time in Africa, of course you got time in Tennessee, got time in Georgia, got time in Africa, got time in Italy, and then France, and then Germany, and then the different officers. And he just does a marvelous job. It's a long read. I think it's 14 half hour read, but it's available in all the different bookstores, Kindle, Nook, etc., that people can listen to it.
Wow, I just wish we had more time because our time is almost up. Is there one last little nugget that you want to share with people before we talk about where we can find you and where we can find the book?
Yeah, well, maybe an encouragement. I saw this study recently that 81% of people believe they have a book in them, and so as I developed this book, what I realized was, Dad fought with 2 million Americans in Europe, and there were 16 million Americans that fought in the war, and all of them had amazing, unbelievable stories, and virtually all of those stories have disappeared. And so if there's something that you have in your past or on your heart, to record that, to go ahead and get that down, so that, and even if it is just a legacy of your family, that'll pass through the family. The second encouragement I have for people is, if there's any way that you can get away from verbal and electronic communication, at least some of the time. If I didn't have Dad's 436 letters, if I didn't have the letters that his colleagues wrote letters, because that's the only way you can communicate home. And those families saved letters and they gave them to me. And some of those guys wrote memoirs, and I found those in the archives. But if they'd have done an email, they wouldn't exist. If they'd been on Instagram or TikTok or Twitter, they would not exist today. And so one of the disciplines that Barb and I have developed, and in fact, over here in my drawer, I now have stationery. So instead of just typing off a quick thank you to someone, I'll pull out the stationery and I'll write a note, a handwritten note, address it. I've got these little, what do you call them, the stamps that are forever stamps that say thank you. And so I put a thank you stamp on there. And so I've begun the discipline of writing to friends, of writing to my children. And our daughter's son, our husband, Charles, said, he calls me Dad. He said, Dad, Kate's saving every one of those letters, but she's not saving every email. And so just to take that time, and don't tell me you don't have time to do it, because if you do, I'll say, do you pee?
Yeah, that's true. That is so true. Now, where can people find you at?
Well, my website's just drwalt.com. That's drwalt.com. You can sign up for my blog. A blog usually comes out 3 times a week. The Monday blog is a health blog. I actually did a 41 TV programs for a streaming network called Liftable. And so it's just a general health blog. It's 25, 30-minute, really nicely produced TV shows on a whole variety of general health products, on how you can be more healthy physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. And then on Wednesday is I blog about life happenings. This interview, if you make it available to me on a URL, Melissa, I'll post it one of the Wednesdays, so people that aren't normally seeing you will be able to learn about you and your podcasts. Those are on Wednesdays, kind of personal, if you would. And then Fridays, I'm running for a year. I did a series of television shows called The Inside Story. It was based upon an old PBS series called Inside the Actors Studio. And I spend 1 hour interviewing mega best-selling authors. And the first half hour, the first program is kind of how they grew up and how they got interested in writing. And then the last half of the program, the second part of each program is, well, how do you write? Like you asked me at the beginning, what's your schedule and how do you write? And so we explore with the best of best authors, best-selling authors, actually the art of writing. And so those blogs are available for free at drwalt.com. Also, almost all of the 41 books I've written are available there. And then all my past blogs, I think there's 5,000 or 6,000 past blogs on a wide variety of topics are available. And we'll be launching actually a daily devotional called Morning Glory, Evening Grace, probably in the next couple of months. And news of that will be available at drwalt.com also.
Wow. And your book, At First Light, is available on Amazon, but where else can they get it?
Well, any of the online stores have it. They vary in the pricing. Amazon we're speaking at the beginning of May of 23, and they just dropped the price like 30 or 35%. It's the lowest that I've seen. It's only available hardback right now. The soft cover is not available yet. I think I don't know when it'll be out. It's also available in a CD form, an audio CD, and then it's available in audiobook. So for Kindle, Nook, or any of your listening devices that you have. So, but Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target, any of the independent bookstores that don't have it can get it for you. And of course, the 500-ton gorilla of books, which is Amazon. If you want to know more about it, you certainly can find out more at drwalt.com. There's a tab, at First Light. And so it'll have, it has the endorsements. I just couldn't believe the endorsements. General David Petraeus, who was head of CIA and four-star general in charge of Afghanistan, was the first general, the first of 5 four-star generals to endorse the book. Famous coaches, Coach K from Duke, actually read the book at the last season that he coached and wrote a review. Dan Reeves, the Super Bowl winning player and then coach for the Atlanta Falcons. I didn't know it at the time, but Dan Reeves read this book on his deathbed.
Oh,
And
wow.
his endorsement was came out just a week or two before he passed away. Joe Gibbs, 3-time Super Bowl winning coach, has endorsed it. And then just super authors that have endorsed it. So anyway, the endorsements, reviews, sample chapters are all available. A couple of videos that are out about the book are all available at drwalt.com. Just go to the At First Light tab.
And what is up next for you besides launching your devotionals?
Well, I've just, for the first time, stepped away from face-to-face patient care. I'm doing some consulting for an insurance company. Barb and I direct a marriage ministry. But instead of retiring, I'm kind of looking at it as refocusing. And so I look forward to the answer to that, to that question. I did have a publisher contact me recently and ask if I would update a book on family fitness. I did a book for Florida Hospital probably 15, 20 years ago called Supersized Kids. It was how to fight childhood obesity. And so there's a major publisher that wants a book on family fitness. So how can we raise kids that are healthy physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually in times as difficult as these? So that's a possibility down the line. I've also thought of, I found another really amazing World War II story, so I may develop that. But right now, Barb and I are heading towards our 50th wedding anniversary this fall. And so she's asked me to take a sabbatical, and we're going to devote ourselves to each other and celebrate this milestone.
Oh, congratulations on 50 years. That is a milestone.
Well, we've been happily married 22.
That's funny. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your dad's story, but also for sharing this time with us because, and for sharing just everything. I mean, you can tell the love you had for your dad. You can tell the respect that you have for these soldiers that have fought the wars, even if they weren't fighting in World War II, the soldiers that have fought regardless of what war they fought in. And just for basically your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, it's been such a privilege. If you'd asked me, what do you think your dad would have thought? And I've only had 3 dreams in my life that I remember. And one of them occurred about 10 days after he passed away. And Barb and I had, after the funeral, had gone to a beach just to have some time to walk and to think and to grieve. And I woke up in the middle of the night, just before dawn. It was just starting to get light. I was just crying like a baby. And Barb said, "What is the matter with you?" And I told her the dream that I had. And she said, "Well, you need to write that down." And the dream is very short, but I was at the funeral and I had been asked by my brothers and by my mom to deliver Dad's eulogy, which I was happy and proud to do. But in the dream, I was standing by Mom in the foyer of the church as people were leaving the funeral service. And I was just watching her greet people as they walked by. And then my dad walked out of the sanctuary. He walked through the door, past people. Nobody noticed him. And he walked right up to me. And I was surprised. And he walked without a limp. And he always had a little bit of limp because of the artificial leg. But he had no limp. And he walked up to me. And I need to tell you that I don't ever remember my dad saying, "I love you." He must have. I just don't remember it. But he walked right up to me and he looked at me and he said, "Did you really mean everything that you said in there?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir. Every single word." He looked down and he looked up with tears in his eyes and he said, "I really do love you." And then my dream ended. And was it a wish? Was it a hope? Was it a vision? I think it was a gift from heaven. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that gift. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share it, Melissa, with your audience. Thank you so much.
Well, anytime you want to come back on and share about what your projects you have coming up, I would love to be back on because I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
You're welcome. Been great fun.
So, guys, I will put where you can find Dr. Walt, all about his websites, where you can find his book, and everything else. Also, I might go ahead and put a couple of links to some history channels, some history links about the Southern Front, so you can get a little bit more acclimated and learn a little bit more about the Southern Front that we were talking about. And as always, be blessed, and most importantly, keep chatting. See you on the next chat for the Blog Cabin. Bye.